And we're live.
Great.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Open Publishing Fest. My name is Dan Rudmann. I'm the Associate Director at Punctum Books and one of the organizers of the fest. Today, I'm speaking with Catherine Despont, who has a lot of amazing experience in alternative and open pedagogy. And we're really here just to talk about our experiences in developing alternative pedagogy programs and to learn from one another. So, Catherine, why don't I let you begin by introducing yourself and telling me a little bit about your work. I've been kind of a fan. I've been following from afar for a very long time, but I don't know, a lot of the impetus and a lot of your efforts. So, please let me know.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's really nice to be here. I feel like I've been sort of like wandering in the wilds a little bit for the last couple of years since I left Pioneer Works, which is where I think you probably first encountered my work. I was the director of education programming at that institution, which is in Brooklyn, New York, and was really interested in the way that cultural institutions could host like alternatives to other education institutions, and that like places like museums or other kinds of exhibiting spaces held like a kind of cultural value in and of itself that could be used as an alternative set of values around kind of experiences of education. So, and I was really interested, or I'm still interested in particular, about like the way that creative forms, the way creative practice generates different relationships to perception and different relationships to learning, and what it would mean to articulate like an education around perception that used the arts to sort of like art practices as as practices of training perception, again as an alternative strain to the kind of like information-based and subject-based education that exists in most of the institutions today. And so I hosted a few different Pioneer Works is an arts institution that's dedicated to intersections between arts and sciences, and they have a exhibiting space, a residency program, recording studio, publishing department, and I hosted a few different things there. One was called the Summit on Pedagogy, which again brought together like a whole weekend of workshops around different modes of teaching and learning. I felt like the spaces in which conversations about alternative education were happening were either like really stuck inside of like educational reform inside of institutions, and that there wasn't a lot of space to actually think really creatively about like our relationships to learning. And so I felt like the arts kind of like had that open space to do some of that creative exploration. And then I hosted the Alternative Art School Fair, which was a convening of about 50 alternative art schools from around the world. I think probably similar in flavor to this program, but in the flesh. And there the question was like as much about what it meant to it was both about introducing people to these kind of like art schools, many of which were very ephemeral, But more than that, it was really to introduce people to the idea of like what it means to start your own school and to talk about that as a practice inside of our relationship to learning in and of itself and as a communal practice. Yeah, and I think that, and all of those questions and been primarily focused on finishing a manuscript of a novel, which is also very connected to observation and perception and the way that a shift in our relationship to observation can really shift what we know of ourselves and of places. So I'm still very much engaged in this question of what it means to educate for perception, and really see that that practice or that conversation as something that needs to be generated or is primarily generated outside of the kind of like institutional educational spaces that we have now. And I can say a lot of reasons why, but I'm curious to hear, because when we were introduced through the lens of punctum books, and then I think afterwards you started all these sort of education spaces yourself, and I would love to hear more about your path to those projects.
Yeah, absolutely. So that all sounds really amazing. There's so many questions, but I think, it makes sense for me to also share my path a little bit as well, and then we'll trade notes. The way that I started working toward alternative pedagogy was really in my move to Austin, Texas, because I was starting a PhD program at the University of Texas. And at the same time, coming to Austin, it was very easy to get immersed into an arts community, in particular, the music community here in Austin. So that there's this really generous, loving group of people who all meet up regularly and help each other out with their songwriting or with learning instruments or with sound production. Or, there's so many different layers, but it's very much community driven, and very, naturally. It's just a matter of, there's this one person who's a great drummer, but also has spent time working in studios, and he's helping this other band. So that was really a model for me, especially coming from the East Coast, where I don't know if this is true generally, so I don't want to speak broadly, but I had felt that there was, in music where I had moved from, there was more of a competitive nature in which, artists felt like there was only so many places to make it, and so you couldn't be as friendly with other musicians because everyone was just trying to really kind of make it, and whatever that was to them, it differed. But so because I was immersed in this community in Austin, while going to graduate school, I kind of saw a lot of similar conversations happening in both realms. So in grad school, we were talking about literature and about our perceptions of literature and ways of thinking and knowing. And, the artists I spoke with in Austin had similar thoughts and were interested in the same ideas, and what I was reading in grad school, they always wanted to ask me about and develop conversations around. So, it started very early to kind of query that dividing line between what was going on in the university and what was going on in the public. And as I was progressing with my graduate school, I started working with Punctum Books, which was run and is still run by Eileen Joy. And Eileen Joy, I think, really exemplifies a lot of these generous modes of being and very creative forms of expression and scholarship. And so it was a really natural fit, and I felt really lucky to be introduced to her and to get to work with her. And so I started helping out with the press, with working on Punctum books, and one day said to her, why don't we take the same model that we have with the press for publishing and apply it to music as well? And of course, Eileen, being Eileen, said, absolutely, let's do this right away. And so we started making records. And it was a real great match in both directions, because the artists that we worked with really wanted to be connected to intellectual rigor. I mean, not be connected, but their work, they saw their work as being intellectually rigorous. And then in the same way, the academics that we were working with wanted their work to, wanted people to understand that their work was also creative. And so having that association was a really wonderful fit on both sides, and again continued that that questioning of whether these dividing lines that we have should really be there at all. So we started making records, and it was going really well, but we realized, after this started, we started making the records in 2013, and by 2014. It was growing as far as the music community was really embracing us. But we decided we needed like a public space to all get together and to be able to share knowledge. We could meet at DIY shows and at music venues, but we wanted like a dedicated space. So this is when the idea for Studium came up in 2014. And Studium, again, being sort of like a sibling organization to Punctum books and records at this point. So Studium was cool because it was me, who had really no resources at all to do anything like this, and no knowledge of how to set up a public space. But what we did was we found this warehouse near downtown Austin, and I kind of proposed to sell books and records. We knew somebody else who wanted to sell vintage clothing. We knew a leather worker. There was a coffee shop nearby that needed extra space. So we found this way to get a lot of people in on sharing a space, because that way we could afford rent. And that the rent issue, it continues to be an issue, but finding this creative way of getting a lot of people together, and also finding regular use for the space. So, if there were times where we weren't as active, certain times of the day, and that made more sense for the coffee shop or more for, the clothing sales or something like that. So it kept the space active. And as we kept the space active and more people just came, they started to talk to me. I was writing my dissertation at the time, more about the work I was doing, and I got to, meet not only the artists who I was working with, but also more the people who would just attend their shows and were fans of the artists. And people wanted to have discussions with me about my graduate school or just about literature in general. And eventually somebody suggested, why don't we just kind of have a reading group here or a class? And so we just started to meet weekly, and I would select a few texts that I was familiar with, and we would just have a roundtable discussion on those texts. And those conversations were amazing, because we got rid of a lot of the, it was very much like a translation of what would happen in a graduate school seminar. But because this was happening in a public space and in, our space where we could kind of set the tone, we got rid of a lot of the fear around having those conversations. Because like in grad school, you're so worried, am I asking the right question? Am I going to sound foolish if I ask this or something like that? But that's where, for me, alternative pedagogy became really the place for teaching and learning, because we were able to have these conversations in a much more stripped from all that pretense and worry or self-consciousness, And so we were able to run this for, it grew, of course. This one weekly class became a critical reading group, a critical theory reading group. And then an extension of that became a weekly class on civic responsibilities. And that was, again, in recognizing the public nature of our courses, thinking about how we need to, we're not just talking about ideas, we need to take that into action, and especially into civic action. So that was very much a compendium to the critical reading group. And then from there, we just had people who were part of, who were taking classes or who were musicians working with us, or just in the public, propose a class they wanted to teach. It could be like an hour on how to build a guitar, or meditation, or we had all these really great proposals that really ran the spectrum, things that I would never have imagined that we could have taught there. But because everyone had all these interesting ideas, and not necessarily a venue where you get to, practice regularly, because it would, not a classroom space necessarily. It grew in that way. Eventually, what happened, unfortunately, was that the real estate market in Austin changed, and we were unable to maintain that space. And then we moved to another space, and the same thing happened, and moved to another space, and the same thing happened. Developers kept buying. At one point, a developer bought the entire block that we were part of, and there was nothing we could do. And so, eventually we had a really amazing coffee shop trailer offer to let us teach our classes at the picnic benches outdoors. And so we did that for about a year. And that was excellent as well. But, that the space issue, I think, was really central. Two issues, of course. Like the community, we were very lucky because starting with a record label, we had a community that was engaged, and then the issue of space. So that was what kind of kept it going.
Mm.
Yeah. So yeah, that's my general story. I mean, I still dream of doing it, as I know you do too. But you've been attending alternative pedagogy programs in the meantime?
Yeah, I ended up I mean, I guess part of well, I've been in lots of really interesting learning environments. I guess for me, it's interesting, you inhabit one world and you are surrounded by people who are thinking in the same way about things you think about. And I kind of extended that. I just assumed that oh, people who were thinking about alternative pedagogies had also connected it to art in the same way that I had, or and yeah, I've spent a lot of time outside of the art world in the last 3 years, which has been both and I felt pretty burned out on the art world when I left. But also then found myself in a lot of spaces where ideas about creativity and making, even though they were using similar language, weren't at all steeped in the same kinds of training and the same kinds of histories that that I was accustomed to. And so what it means to be talking about creative practice outside an art context, and why people are attracted to that idea, but what it means to them is very, very different. And so I so that's kind of understanding what people are what people are trying to express when they invite in something like creative practice.
Mhm.
And I think, because of the way that our education is often like so strictly defined by like certain practices or parameters, something like, putting away the computer and like picking up a drawing pencil or something can like invite in this sort of like flood of new experiences for people that feels like incredibly rich, but often then isn't like really directed in any specific way to like an idea of a training or awareness. And so this is like this kind of um, tension that I found between like the kinds of trainings within the art world, which are these like really beautiful like relationships to making and to material and to iterating, which is a whole thinking in itself that I think like connects humans to very different parts of our brains and our physiognomy and our attention. Um, but that um, but that art as it's taught now is not specifically connected to any like particular school of thought about who the artist is in society and what kind of responsibilities or relationships to experience or developed through art making. I think there's a lot of desire for art making to be recognized as forms of research in and of itself. Um, but I think in a lot of ways, like people don't really articulate the ways in which that research like could become um, like serious in its own forms, like what are the standards, what are we understanding about an art practice, like what element of art practice could become a basis for rigor or for yeah. And on the other side there are sort of alternative schools of education that are disconnected from like art practice per se, but that like understand how deeply important it is to have some relationship to creativity or to reconnect to making as a form of thinking. But but then also like kind of just use it as an example, like a way of asking the question, but in themselves aren't necessarily developing practices that produce another kind of training.
So would you say this is like an issue of community and governance, or is this something about like the way in which we can have, a comparative rubric between works that's not necessarily judgmental in a way, but just so we have something to work toward or to work against as well?
I think for me the missing link between the two has become like about articulating some sort of relationship to attention, like what is attention in and of itself, and like how is it as a skill, like how do we practice attention like separate from like the subjects that we're studying, so if our education is based around the idea of information and discipline, uh, what would it mean to actually articulate like what the value or what the power is of human attention in and of itself, and how there are forms of perceiving the world that only come by practicing attention. And so, physiologically, like what creative forms do is they ask or they light up different parts of the human brain, for instance, or the human sensory organ. And a lot of like, if you think about our society as having been built around like certain habits of perception, certain like habits of rationale and thinking, like uh like all the way we structure reality is really based around those habits. And so like if you interrupt the habit, you put the person in position to like feel stuff they don't feel most of the time. And I think this is what the language of music does. You know, this is like what movement does. This is what drawing as a observation, a practice of observation, it does. It like puts you into a totally different relationship to the physiology of perception. And and um and once you've done that, then like you've allowed the body, or you've allowed the person to become conscious of like all sorts of different levels of information. And so really then like the way in which those levels of information like become translated into like information or description is connected to like how aware you can be and how much you can practice like your attention in ways, you know. So our problem, like part of the problem for me right now and the way we define like a paradigm of reality is that like we don't realize like how much we resist what it means to feel just a different paradigm. I mean, even what it means for someone to like try and draw from life when they're not used to doing that, like the frustration of that, or the boredom, or the, you know, is we think of that as a lack of creativity, but actually like on a very simple level, that's just an interruption of like one mode of thinking.
So what's so cool about this is when I think about connecting the arts to education, I mean, I'm thinking about it, and I know you are too, in terms of the community around that, and in terms of the level of thought that goes into expression. But I think what you're expressing here is like an entire layer that is implicit and is in there, but I've never heard articulated in this way before. And I really love is it through this idea of attention, because I've attended, when we would, in our space, we would have classes, we would also have performances and shows. And you forget it between shows in a way, but when you're in that moment, when you are giving an artist your attention, or when you are practicing art yourself, I think you're right. What it does to you, and like on a physiological level, and how that enriches your being, or helps you open up to new ways of thinking. It's just something I've never thought of so clearly in this way. I really love that. I think, I come at, I think, starting at education and moving towards art, where this feels to me like starting at art and moving toward education, which is just so well thought out. I really love that. Thank you for, yeah.
Well, and I think I've had to kind of like reassess parts of my thinking about like what art is too in relation to this. You know, it starts from art in the sense that like I think of creative forms as alternate languages of thought. Like it's not just like it opens you up to new thought. They are actually like the other languages of thought.
Mm-hmm.
They are the languages of different kinds of thinking. And but a lot of art itself is not like interested in articulating this level of practice, is not really in relation to this. It's in relation to it unconsciously in some ways, but it's not like necessarily like exploring like these relationships as like a basis for research, or as a basis for justice, really, because embedded in any like of these relationships is the way that like we are relating in
How we,
space and in community and in
how we order the world.
yeah.
And so do you think it's about bringing all of those individuals together in, whether it's a space or in conversation, so that, because of course, like it shouldn't all be on just the person creating to make those connections. So there's a way in which creating an environment in which those elements can really interact.
Totally.
That you can get to all of those different forms of expression within art.
I think the environment is essential for it to go from like an individual experience into like something that we could name as a pedagogy or as education, because it's and in fact, like I found that like having community built around this is essential, because like once you start talking about a shift in your relationship to perception and to observation, like you're talking about a shift in relationship to what your reality is, and a lot of that is like a very it brings up really challenging like levels of experience, like how you sit vis-a-vis yourself and your memory and your past, and how you sit vis-a-vis society. Like all of these things become questions when you start to work with like perception in this way. And so you really do need like a community of practice of people who are holding each other like in support of those relationships. And when you reached out, or in the description for this conversation, you mentioned like, identifying what the new sites are for like open education or for shift in education.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm living on a farm right now, and have really been thinking about farms and rural places or communal like sites that have like, they're really dynamic in terms of like the things that occur and the way they sit in relation to the living world, and the ways in which you share community, or you live in community with people when you live in a place like this. And I've really come to feel like to like host the kind of learning that I'm interested in, it would need to be embedded in like a communal living situation, like because you have to invite all the parts of like life that are normally like held outside the walls of like the learning institution.
We're very much on the same page with this, actually. I think that's absolutely where we were going toward too. With Studium, it increasingly grew into different areas. We became a place to hang out every hour of the day, and that had something for you at every hour. And having that holistic approach to both education and to a person, I think is where you can really enrich people and have very sincere exchange of teaching and learning. So yes, being on something like a farm where you can take care of those needs as far as your how to eat and where to sleep and how to be together. We've been thinking about, so I continue to work with Punctum books, particularly in developing community. And, when we think about what could be another phase of Studium, we think about it as like a residency situation in which people could stay there for an extended period of time and participate. And there was, when Studium was developing, I wanted to start just having a pressure cooker in the space, so that I can provide people with some, lentils and rice or something like that. And I would call it Studium. And you you become part of people's lives in this way, with education. I mean, this is where like the institution, the university, I think is so wonderful as a space where people live for a set period of time, or an extended period of time, and live together and eat together and learn together, and do all these things that happen both inside and outside of like the classroom time or experience that still contributes to that learning. So
yeah. But of course, like in this moment, like the degree to which that has been like is just being used by like in like corporate institutions at universities that have become like corporate entities, like right now they have like no way of protecting or interest in protecting that part of their community. They've sent everyone home, rightly or wrongly. They've said basically like these aren't real communities. This is an aspect of an experience that you're paying for, but what you're really paying for is the credential. And and so like the community can be removed at a drop of the hat when there's an emergency.
Yeah.
So like
you're right. Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. The university, like it's so much of its richness is built on the fact that students live together in community, and that these communities are formed on campuses. But like this virus is showing us to what degree that has become like really not authentic to the business of education. And it's and universities are going to be scrambling over the next year and a half to make the case for offerings that may have to take place like virtually. And I think we're fine. I think this really is a moment where a lot of people might become willing to like sign on to a different a very different channel, if that channel existed. And yeah. I'm not sure that channel exists right now, but I think that this moment is very much about should be about imagining like the scenarios and the possibilities in which that takes place, but not just, it's like, I feel like you need to articulate like not just how you continue to teach the things that we already teach, but like how the pedagogy, how like the mode of teaching itself, like, and the thing that is taught becomes as radically different as the spaces that we're teaching from.
Yes, I love that so much, because as I said, I was trying to translate the graduate seminar experience into a public space, but I don't think, I didn't have the tools or the awareness to think critically about how that could really very drastically change the form. And your description of this really makes me pause and hesitate on, what really should happen in these spaces. And it's not just, people sitting around a table and having a debate about a book. There's so much more possibility there.
Yeah. And of course, like we don't, like you need a moment to define like what we need to learn, and we haven't really been, people have been like agitating for a while, like the part of the reason I organized the Alternative Art School Fair was that I felt like in my research I was seeing over the last like 10-15 years this big surge in communities of artists who were self-organizing around the idea of their own education, either because like the price of education was totally unrealistic, or because they genuinely felt that the values of the art training that was being given were like not aligned to the experience of the world or the needs of society, and they wanted different kinds of conversation about art and making. And and I think a lot of the way people talk about, oh, what people should be learning and what people should be doing has really been based around these like projections of kind of like technological capitalist growth futures, in which like, yes, some people are suffering, but we just need to train more workers to, be in IT or be in VR or be in whatever, and it's like, and okay, what language should kids be learning in, in grade school now? Is it Chinese? Like this kind of like predictive like curriculum setting is like totally unrelated, it's totally unrelated to like any sort of value around like deep human needs of connection or like awareness or understanding or wisdom. It's utterly disconnected from any mode of wisdom.
Yes.
And so, but for so many people, there is no way to, like the moment of like change never, it like, we needed to feel a collective sense of moment of change, because in a system that is like creates so much instability for people, like how could you opt out of something like a college education? Like how could you opt out of these trainings, like when no one's guaranteed a job or work, and your security is completely dependent on like these totally flimsy fluctuating systems. And and now I think like life is looking very different for a lot of people, and is relieving in a lot of ways, because yeah, I think some people, not all people, but I think some people in this moment are ready to form different kinds of community, and that and they I think that idea of community is going to be much more connected to like these kind of like longer term questions about like relationship and health and um yeah, that it could never like intercede in the way we've been thinking about education and work and for a very long time now.
You're absolutely right. I do feel like a very much a sense of loss in this moment that, the work that I had done is not still holding on in some kind of like bare bones infrastructure way, because I feel like that could provide shelter to people right now. Even though we couldn't meet in person, like for example, when we were, when things were dwindling, unfortunately, because of our problems with getting space, the 2016 election happened. The next day we had our regular critical theory reading group class. And that class was the most well-attended class that we'd ever had, of course. And people really needed to be together. They needed to just, sit and think together and be kind of sad. It wasn't even like we weren't animated. We were pretty sullen and everything. But, having that space for people to be together and to think together, what direction should we go in now is what's really needed. And we do have there is a lack there, unfortunately. And so that's really challenging. But so one thing I wanted to go back to that you mentioned was, what I heard from, one, there is, of course, in alternative pedagogy, an implicit critique of the university, because we wouldn't need to be setting up these alternative structures if the space that was before us meant for this kind of education was doing its job. And so one thing that I think that you just articulated well was the inability of the university to be responsive quickly to needs that are evolving. And of course, when I was in university, I would read books that were, published 30, 40 years ago, or, a long time ago. And that would be sort of like the prevailing research that we would be discussing. And that's a real missed opportunity in a lot of ways, because there are people thinking about this work now and doing and writing and saying important things that really respond to the moment we're in, whether that's because of the virus right now, or because of the rise of fascism over the last few years, or the climate crisis that is coming and will persist throughout our lifetime. And this is where, just to connect it to themes with the Open Publishing Fest, where I'm very hopeful in seeing all of the efforts in publishing open right now, because it does create a more active conversation and more immediate conversation. So we were able, when we were hosting our reading group, week to week, I could switch it up and say, well, this major event just happened. I mean, actually, this is, another very difficult event, but we had a school shooting, and we were able to immediately, in the next days, organize readings and material so that we could really help process this together and discuss this together in a really productive and helpful way to a lot of people. And so this is where I think publishing is really important. And I know you are really active in thinking a lot about publishing as well, that publishing should be more open and responsive and immediate in order to speak to the moments that we are in. So tell me a little bit about your publishing work.
I definitely think publishing should be open in the sense of definitely where it relates to sort of research and academic work, where that exists as a barrier that's pretty unique compared to other parts of publishing. The idea that you have to pay subscriptions of tens of thousands of dollars to have access to things, it just goes crazy.
Very much so.
I also think I actually feel I also think that there is so much being published all the time. For me, there are parts of it where I feel I don't know, it's hard to find, I actually really do believe in sort of a publisher's editorial sort of vision, to help articulate some sort of landscape of thought, or some sort of, and I think I often feel just overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that is being self-published or open that there's I think I'm someone who longs for more digestion and for words to be held back into a space where they carry more weight, I just I've I want to read fewer things more deeply. I want to read and reread things, and I want text. I want people to write texts, myself included, that really ask for a different relationship to time, that feel like they're rich enough or deep enough to contain or to sustain some kind of long-term relationship, and I think the way that we publish, I think there's so much pressure to sell things and to publish things quickly and to make to write quickly. I'm saying this as someone who just taken 12 years to finish a manuscript. Um, and I realized that that's not really a feasible mode for most people to work in. But personally, that's where the relationship to writing for me becomes rich, is in the way that it stretches my relationships to time, or the way that it becomes an architecture that can accumulate thought in ways that are happening much, much too quickly, or because of all the pressure there is to release information or have something out by a deadline. I feel like I'm much more interested in sort of staking out space where different relationships to time can manifest. And that goes for writing, and it goes for all sorts of things, for thinking, for community, the way time changes when you're living in community with people, the way relationships change and so all of this stuff has its expression in different areas of life. And I think the goal for me is asking about what kind of situation could you set up in which as many different parts of life could become touched or changed by changing their relationship to time.
That's yes. And yes, I absolutely agree that also very much speaks to what you were describing with having a site of alternative pedagogy potentially be a farm, or a place where there's residency as well, because it is certainly about, about attention, as you said earlier, about giving proper affordance to attention, so that we can really, your use of the word perception, I think, is really wonderful here, in that's what we are working to change. That's what we are developing with alternative pedagogy. We at Studium, actually, so as you talk about this in terms of time, I had thought about it in terms of space. And we had built this diagram, actually, this kind of radiating outward. And the idea was at the very core was the classroom. I use the classroom, that term, very loosely, but the education space. And that was for knowledge that was generated specifically in that space. The next layer radiating outward was the performance or presentation, and that was for the more immediate community. And then the final layer was the publication, and that was to spread, hopefully, globally. And so I think it's a really cool thing to think about it in both of those terms together, because they're interconnected in a similar way.
Yeah. And I love the idea. I absolutely think publishing should be connected to learning, but not necessarily that writing is such a strange practice. It's such a challenging practice to find formal ways of presenting thought or experience. And I think, different disciplines have their the ways that they've articulated that form. The academic form is pretty strict, and it's strict for certain reasons. It's strict in order to generate certain modes of investigation and research and connection, and
Totally.
Contextualizing things and mapping like a lineage of thought. And these are really important.
That's very generous that you put it that way. I think that's really well done. Yeah.
I mean, in the ideal sense, like you can understand like why the form like is structured the way that it is, like, of course, like it's used in ways that like, to prop up a lot of like, boring thought, because it's not like, because when the form is so like distinct, then people can like rely heavily on just like the tone of the form to say nothing at all. And that's where like you want to generate like a community of practice that can really say like, no, actually nothing is being said here, like we've quoted and we've cited and we've like and we've done surveys and whatever, but like what is actually the quality of the knowledge that like is being defined here? And that's really like the conversation that we are not able to have in so many places right now, is like, what is the quality? Where is wisdom? Like what is it that this person knows really? Like, does it feel to us like it's a real form of knowing? And what do we mean by that? Like, are we satisfied by knowing that like defends itself in terms of these like formal structures, or is there a level of our soul that is just like is hungry for something else, something more humane, and something that feels more alive, and that the thinking of which like takes us to places that are like less certain and riskier. And I think like in order to think like have real thoughts, have risky thoughts, you also need to live in ways that are like that invite that own possibility of transformation into your own life. And that's where like the importance of community becomes essential, because you need to be able to trust that there are some sort of structures that will like sustain you as you step out into that like investigation. And our economic system is certainly not doing that for people. Like when the cost of living is so exorbitantly high, you can't have creative thinkers. You can't, when there is, when there's a complete breakdown around like that notion of like what a fact is, and like and what truth is, then like you can't hold yourself accountable. There is no holding accountable things. So like you need it, in a society that is like really sick, you're not going to get like big swaths of people to agree about this, but to the extent that you can build like sanctuary, and I think you said the word too, like build these sort of like sanctuaries that allow like some sort of like stability and health to be present. That's really what you need more than anything in order to do like big kinds of thinking.
Well, this is what is, I think, like very amazing about this conversation in general. At the time when we were running our alternative pedagogy programs, and way before, I mean, it continues, there's always this like, what's the value of this kind of learning? What's the value of education, of the humanities, of the arts? There were all these like think pieces that were like, we're not teaching kids how to make enough salary, so it's useless, But I think what you're describing here is such an amazing way of reframing this argument, in that like this is how we sustain each other. This is how we live. And that's really important, especially now, because I think a few years ago, when these crises were not so upfront, people could dismiss that and be like, we're fine, we're going to be fine no matter what. But, we went into, by week 2 of lockdown, 10 million people lost their jobs. And that number has climbed to 30 million. And so there's no longer that pretense of this stuff is nice, but the stuff that sustains people is capitalism and business.
Yeah. Or also why, there is, there's risk involved in choosing to live in another, there are parts of the system, even the systems that we don't like, there are parts of them that we do like and rely on, and I mean, as someone who has been very critical of the systems for a while, and who has been living kind of very lightly on the world the last 3, I've been moving around a lot. I've been in very temporary situations, and I've been kind of choosing those situations so that I could focus on parts of my work that I knew I wouldn't have the attention for if I was, busier with a job or something. But I've been since quarantine started, I've been surprised to realize how much, how kind of, I say it's like this moment in an earthquake where the asphalt suddenly becomes liquid, where it's suddenly without all these other systems holding in place, there are parts of my own a relationship to reality that feel even more fluid now, so it's very basic, you change the where you live, and you change who you're around, and you change what you're eating, and and life feels very, very, very different. But people have been running so ragged just to keep going. They haven't been able to be in any position where they're asking themselves does the way my life is, or is the way my life is organized, really reflective of the things I think? There's such a disparity right now between our thinking and our living. But I think right now there are people who are not going to be able to stay in the places that they've been living, and who are experiencing urban places not as these sites of endless opportunity, but as these environments of deep, deep, deep uncertainty, without access to food, without access to the outdoors, without access to all of these. It's reorienting people to what is really life-giving and life-sustaining, whereas when people were just trying to keep the money coming in, they couldn't ask themselves about how they felt in relation to their environment. And I think I think now some people can, now the farm is looking way more exciting to people, and one of the things I wonder what you've kind of been imagining in relation to what the ideal space looks like going forward. But for me, and for some of the people I've been talking to and listening to, there's this kind of idea. I like the idea of a house or a farm becoming a pod for a certain amount of time, and there are 20 people who come in, and you're together for 3 months, and then maybe the pod rearranges itself and people move to another house and recreate a community. And I could imagine maybe your the learning environment is like that, is become these sites that that convene and then disperse and reconvene in other ways, and that's the way you share culture, you develop culture, and you share experience, and you share sustenance, and then you do that kind of like in these sort of like closed spurts, like over
Mm-hmm.
over different places. Um, and like imagining that kind of thing, like it wouldn't take that many resources. It wouldn't take much in the way of resources to get that, like
Yeah.
renting a house, deciding how people come into it, like deciding what you do once you're there. But I think these things are really fun to think about because they emphasize like totally different sets of skills, like around like how something like that becomes organized to be interesting, like intellectually or socially, like what kinds of skills, um, what sort of intentionality around communication, what forms of culture become like central to like the activity of learning, like once you're in a zone like that.
Yeah, I think that's such a really lovely way to imagine how you can convene community. I mean, especially now where we really have to, it's not going to be as casual as having a space that people can come in and out. We have to be very intentional. Um, and I do think this holistic view of thinking about someone's experience from sun up to sundown, and how they will eat, how they will sleep, how they will be able to structure their time together, how we can support one another in a lot of different ways when we're together, will generate. This was one thing. I think what you're describing as well, and what we were able to do with Studium, is not have the scaffolding of this, but allow people to contribute in any way that was appropriate for them. When to the aspect of community is such a dialogue. So it's not, of course, us implementing a curriculum or a set, but allowing that to be generated from within the community. But what you're describing, I think, seems like a brilliant way to allow that to flourish. That would be certainly, my dream of, really getting to have that experience, that meaningful experience with people of teaching and learning from one another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, let me, I think we've been talking for about an hour. We have a question
Okay.
for you.
Great. I didn't even realize we could have questions. That's great.
Yes, there's on the live stream, if anyone else is there and would like to ask a question. Paula Wilson asks, do you think the distance between artistic thinking and production has been limited by the art market's desire for the primacy of objects over the act of making?
Paula, dear friend. Yes, for sure. I mean, I think like I think in the same way that like publishing, now demands that like X number of books come out a year, like, it pushes us into a zone where like the question around making is like totally conflated with production. Um, and and we can't really like afford a space to to like think about making in relation to other in relation to other things, in relation to like one thing I was going to say actually when you were talking before, and then I was wondering whether it was like veering off into something else, but um uh part of the structures that I've been like introduced to and inhabiting in the last couple of years around the idea of like a counsel practice, which is like a form of intentional speaking where people sit in circle and talk one at a time and talk from the heart. There are like four rules of counsel: that you talk one at a time, you talk from the heart, you talk brevity, and you talk with spontaneity. And that the group as a whole like manifests the intelligence that, like, in relation to whatever the question is. So it's not just about like any one person like having the brilliant answer, but that like everyone's experience is invited in equally in a way that like generates this more holistic understanding of a situation. And one thing that has been like so surprising to me in those spaces is to um, see how often expressions like become performative or creative, like how often they turn into poetry, or how often a poem is the thing that's offered or that ends up spoken in that space, or the way that they invite movement or the way that they invite song and singing. And it's like um uh suddenly, instead of, it was like the first time in my life actually I think I had experienced any of these forms as like necessary components of like communal understanding, and not as like something that happened kind of like on the outside or on the edge, or in as a form of entertainment, or as a kind of like secondary like form. And so like I think um when we stop thinking about like the making as the thing, the product, but like if we really developed like forms of culture and society that like understood like those specific creative forms as necessary expressions within like a more holistic understanding of wisdom, or of what needed to be said and how it needed to be said, then I think we could start to see like the artist or the maker as someone who was doing more than making things, but someone who was like responding, or who was um, describing our experiences for us in a way that were like socially and culturally necessary to some sort of like group process.
Yes. Yeah. It makes me think a lot about the issues around like alienated labor. Just having that disconnect between the object and the process. One thing that we were hoping to do with Studium, and it's good that you brought up publishing in this as well. The latest iteration of the space that we were hoping to develop had a print shop in it. And so we had acquired a few printing machines with plans to get some old, really interesting kind of linotype style or letterpress, machines. And our hope was to, one, develop pieces in, I think, similarly in kind of a slow, intentional way, in a way that demanded further attention to how we were creating. But two, like, really think about every step in the process of developing meaning around what the work we were doing, making sure that we were aware of exactly what paper, exactly how much time it took to create a certain object. And so that could, and try our best then to express that with the object, so that it was not, this just the thing that comes out at the end of the machine, but really our entire process, just the next step. Because of course that object, then the hope would be that the object was not the conclusion, is that object would live on and generate other aspects and generate other discussions and ways of making and thinking, so that it was not an endpoint, I guess. Yeah. Thank you for asking that question, Paula. Catherine, it was really, really enlightening to speak with you and really lovely. Thank you so much for coming on here and talking to me about this. I'm so glad that we get to talk now, because I really think this work is so important in this moment, and whatever we can do to create these sanctuaries again, because it's something that I think in doing this we knew that was always needed, but it becomes more and more apparent, with every passing day. So I hope that you're able to continue on and create what you're envisioning, because I think it sounds really important and really amazing.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I'm just very grateful that you reached out in this moment too. And I think like it's really super important to be exchanging, like experiences around what we've made. And, it's fun to hear you say that you were like, you were cooking soup too. Like early on, I realized that like soup needed to be in a lot of the formats that I was hosting too. And it feels like there are these little, there are these details that like when you get onto the trail of thinking, like that become necessary no matter where you kind of started.
Totally.
But yeah, I think, I guess my main question right now in terms of like how to step forward is like what are the basic like structures that would allow people to self-organize around some of these ideas and get to interesting places on their own, and that feels like a really important question, because like, we're not going to be able to like invite large groups of people in, but that's why things like council practice, these like things that orient people into a specific kind of relationship, like council practice or communal living, or certain, like creative languages, especially around music, like, what are the elements that are going to allow people to like reform a relationship, or like form some kind of foundation that is going to like blossom into like the new thing. And I think like I hope that I'll get to start practicing some of this in space with people in the next year, but I think definitely just getting together with people, trying to articulate like what these structures are and writing about those things in a way that can kind of like just activate like resources that people already have at their disposal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a lovely thing about community, is that until you start this conversation with people, you don't necessarily realize all of the ways in which they can contribute and all the talents and thoughts that they have. It's really an issue of giving people agency and empowering people to build something like this, because people will really amaze you in what they're capable of in contributing to something larger like this. Yeah. Well, that's where I think what you're saying about council practice and ways of conducting this we really need to think a lot about, because this could happen in a very equitable way, if it's done with these intentions.
And one thing I think about too is also like what are the challenges of enacting like these kinds of ideas with the people who are already around you, like I think a lot of times we like have an idea and then are kind of like searching, sometimes audiences need to self-form around ideas, like not every idea can be like held by like every audience, but there is something interesting to me about like what is like the particularities of the difficulty of like doing this stuff with the people that you're already with, like I
Yes.
kind of like shyly invited my farm mates here to have like a poetry session on my deck the other night, and it's like, how do we interrupt our own days and like reorganize ourselves and our relationships to each other in a different way, even around like singing to each other or reciting a poem. And like actually like what the things that make that small gesture difficult are like really interesting to me, because I think like those are exactly the discomforts, the relationships and the discomforts that are like why that feels uncomfortable has everything to do with like the way we self-organize around like a different set of systems. And so to see some of that discomfort and to see some of that intimacy, not as like um, the failure of an idea, but to see it as kind of like an interesting, um, yeah, like element of of dismantling, of
Yeah.
like of interruption, like that, to see that as an interruption of like an old pattern in relation to something new, and to investigate like what are the resistances to the intimacies that like present themselves in
No,
that
that's so right on. Absolutely. That's when we would have our courses, there was every once in a while some hesitation when people were new because they were not sure, if they felt confident enough to participate, to share their ideas. Um, and it really takes a lot of care in bringing people in and then allowing yourself to be open to, critiquing what is stopping you from certain ways of organizing. I always would really take my position in kind of leading or convening some of these classes very seriously, and we would read something really dense and difficult, and people would look to me as the person, getting a graduate degree and think like, I don't know what to say. You know what to say. And when I would say like, I have no idea what's being talked, what Hegel is talking about here, that opened up space and like
Mhm.
allowed people to breathe. And um, yeah, it takes, I think, from the people who are organizing a lot of this. I think, in what you've described throughout this conversation, a lot of this, or what you've not described, but what you've kind of demonstrated that you've embodied, is this generosity
Mhm.
in the way that in which you organize, and that gives me like a lot of hope for these things to go on. In which, I don't know if this was your experience, but when I couldn't continue on with Studium, it was very, very heartbreaking, in a lot of ways. And I thought, all the stuff that we're up against is insurmountable. But hearing what you're talking about, and I think also, as you've said, more opportunities for people who've had this experience to talk and share ideas and to think about what we could generate next is really important, because we've
Mhm.
been doing it, in our own zones, and haven't had as much opportunity to learn from one another.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's keep having this conversation, I hope, because it's so awesome what you're doing. So yeah.
Well, thank you. You too. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think the lesson right now is just to start from where you are, like to do what you can, and to really take like, to be curious and interested in like um the like what makes something difficult, and what feels like it's a risk, even if that risk is like really small, even then that risk is like holding silence, you know giving space for something that's been said, or inviting asking a question and inviting like answers that haven't been solicited before.
Mhm.
um, these are all like really powerful gestures, and like the more we can understand that kind of gesture at the center of what we mean, uh, like when we say a learning environment or a learning experience, then I think like we're on the way to a very different relationship to knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. That's really well said. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. Great to see you.
All right.